Hey everybody, welcome back to the Engineered Angler. No lure in the middle. That lure is on its way to the Pacific Northwest. So let's make another lure. I want to make a multi-part swim bait that looks like a panfish. Something like this. So this is my idea of what a panfish would look like. And I want to cut this so it has 3 joints. One at about 1/3 of the way back, and then 2 more evenly divided in the space left over. And I want the length of the body to be 4 1/4 inch, which is about 10.8 centimeters. And that's just for the trunk of the body. The tail, I'll do by sight a little bit. I'm going to make it separately. So we'll decide on the shape, the height, and the length a little later. The height of the main body is going to be 1 3/4 inches, which is about 4.45 centimeters. The thickness is going to end up being around 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to make the main body out of a piece of camphor that I've already ripped to width, cut the length, and then I split it on the bandsaw. And I end up with these 2 pieces, and I need 2 pieces because I'm going to do the clamshell method again, because we're going to do a kind of hinge that you need to get inside of the body. I've taken a piece of teak that I had laying around and ripped it down to some thin pieces. And I made 3 different thicknesses because I'm not really exactly sure how I'm going to make that tail. So before we move on, if you're new to the channel, my name's Franco. I'm a professional engineer, a lure designer and lure builder, and an avid fisherman. And I make these videos to try to share some of the things I've come up with, some of the tricks I've learned, and to add a little bit of physics and engineering to the art of lure making. And for everyone else who commented last week, thank you so much for all the support and all the really kind comments. Now there was one really cool takeaway. Somebody offered the idea of having a question of the week in every one of the videos. And I really like that idea. So we're going to do that today. I'm going to answer one of the questions that came into the comments, and we'll do it later on in the video. Before I can transfer that drawing onto these pieces of wood, I want to temporarily glue them together. And I'll do it with this spray-on Elmer's glue. It's super easy to use. Just got to be careful not to overspray on anything because it's hard to get off. After a few minutes, they get nice and tacky. And I'll drop it in this plastic jaw vise and just give it a light clamping. All right, so while that's in the vise, let's talk about where we're going to put the cuts. I want to put the first cut right about 1/3 of the way back. I want the last cut with enough meat in the tail section that I can still get that hinge in there. And the center cut halfway in between. So you end up with something that looks kind of like this. So let's talk about the kind of hinge I'm going to use. I'm actually going to use a continuous fabric hinge. And I'm going to make it out of this sailcloth I have laying around from an old sailboat. And what I like about this stuff is that it's super strong in tension in any direction. And that the weave is so tight that it's really resistant to any kind of fraying at the edges. And you can get an adhesive to stick to it pretty well. So I guess if I'm going to depict it in a drawing, it'll come out of the front one and come into the back one right at the center line. And as far as the hardware goes, we'll have a tail hook eye right about here, a belly hook eye right here at the end of the first segment, and then the tie-on eye just a little above center line on the very nose. And the reason for that, I'll explain later. All right, the blocks are glued together well. Let's go ahead and get a drawing service on this. Okay, I'm going to do a little bit of a change in plan. Instead of having a cut at the tail in the main body, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a tail out of this really thin teak, and I'll use the same sort of sandwiching technique so that I can sandwich the sail material in there and I won't need to make a cut. I'll just have the tail shaped out of this thin stuff, and once it's on there with the hinge, it'll just move, and that should reduce the effect of the tail on the action, which is usually pretty substantial. All right, sorry for the change of plans in the middle of it. Let's go ahead and cut this out. Crap, I think I broke the blade. Oh, yeah. Yep. Oh well, I'm gonna have to replace it with a 1/2-inch blade. That means cutting it out is gonna take a little longer. With this 1/2-inch blade, I'm gonna have to do a lot of little cheater relief cuts. All right, so besides taking a lot longer to cut it with that 1/2 inch blade, it also takes a lot more sanding to get the little gouges out. I'm gonna keep taking the gouges out and then we'll move on to the next step. So as much as I don't like V-joints, I'm gonna go ahead and use V-joints here. And I'm just using a little machinist square set at 45 degrees. And I'm drawing from my joint mark to the center. All right, I've got all my cut lines in and I'm ready to go ahead and start cutting. Alright, so I've gone ahead and sketched in what I think will be a nice shape looking down at the lure, the taper from the front to the back, but it doesn't have to be perfect at this point. I just need to have a basic line to work my way down to, and then the rest is done by eye and carefully shaping it to make sure it's nice and symmetric. And that's really key on a swim bait because you're depending solely on the shape of your lure for the action of the lure. When you put a bib on the lure to give you that action, it can actually override a little bit of asymmetry in your design, but a swim bait has to be pretty much perfectly symmetric. And the other key element is where you put the tie-on eye. Because what you want is for a line between your tie-on eye and the center of the lure at the tail to divide the lure in equal areas. Now, that means a lot of eyeballing. I do have a technique of drawing lines and getting a better estimate through a little bit of graphics to be able to get that line. But on a lure this deep, because you can put a lot of weight far from the center of buoyancy, you can develop a little more stability. And that helps with any kind of error you have on the location of your tie-on eye. All right, I've taken the tape off, and the front one I'm gonna save so I can use this drawing as a template for my carving. All right, as usual, I'm gonna shape this thing using this belt sander. It goes pretty quick, especially since this is camphor. Camphor is soft and the density is about twice that of balsa. It's kind of like a really light cedar. So we'll fast forward through this pretty quickly. I just wanted to give you a quick look at where I am. It's still really rough, but you can start seeing that I'm developing symmetry. Try not to get out of whack, because it's hard to bring it back. Another 10 minutes, got to get it close enough for hand sanding, and I'll get back to you at that point. Oh, all right, this stuff got some really fine dust, and I think it looks really good. Lure like this, with all the contours, can be a little bit daunting to get it shaped so it looks like a natural fish. So it's kind of narrower at the bottom than it is at the top. And the head stays a little wide so that the gill plates look natural. Still got a little more sanding to do, but it's getting a little late. So I'm gonna go ahead and finish the sanding and call it a night.
Bright and beautiful new morning, and let's go ahead and do the question of the week. So this is the first question of the week, and it comes from Emerson. And Emerson wants to know what I would do if I was making a mold for a long, slender lure, where I would place the pouring sprue, which is the little hole where you pour in the material to avoid getting bubbles in your casting. So he was curious about how to position the lure in the mold and then where to put that sprue. Assuming it's some sort of needle-shaped lure, it's probably a bit wider in the back, and that could create some areas for bubbles to form if you were to tilt this way and put the sprue in and you poured it in from the nose down. I don't really recommend any lure being poured from either the very front or the very back and having your mold stand up and you pour it this way. For two big reasons. One, if you do that, then you're going to have to vent both sides. You'll have to cut vents in your mold in both directions. The other thing is that whichever way you pour it, let's say you pour it from the nose of the lure, this portion of the lure it's going to have a much lighter density. It's going to have little micro air bubbles in the casting resin. And if you put micro balloons in there, it's going to even be lighter. And you have two things going against you. It's a lot lighter, so you need to add more lead per volume of your casting. So you're going to have some challenges up here getting the weight right. My recommendation is to pour somewhere near the widest spot of your lure and pour it horizontally, so as it fills, the only places for air bubbles is in that top surface, so you would want to vent the lure in a few places towards the top seam of your silicone mold. This way you avoid any bubbles, you minimize little undercut areas, and you'll be sure that the most buoyant part of your casting will be near the top. That usually gives you the best results. So moving on with our project at hand, I've got it shaped and sanded pretty nicely. I always find that whenever I'm doing something a little bit different, the most difficult part is coming up with the sequence of construction, right? What do I do first? So I don't get so far along that I can't do something I wanted to do before. So what I'm going to do now, before I actually separate these two pieces, is I'm going to cut a groove for the fins. And I'm going to do that with my Dremel. I'm going to be using these wooden tongue depressors to make the fin, and it needs to be just a little wider. Alright, that's got it pretty close. Let's work on the other side. I put it in the slot and I'll draw in a rough drawing of what the shape of that fin is going to be, and I'll cut it off right there where that line is. And I'll do the same for the larger one on top. But I can't glue them in just yet. That'll come a little later. I just start sketching freehand, kind of what I think it should look like, and I'll keep working on that until I like the shape, and then I'll grind it down with a little drum sander on the rotary tool. Alright, so after a little bit of shaping, sanding, that's what the two fins look like. I think they look pretty natural. Let's move on. So here's where the sequence of construction really comes into play. I think I'm going to have to go ahead and cut through the lure and then see where the fins are going to have to get cut. Cut those and then set them aside because they're going to be the last thing that get glued in, I think. Alright, so I do want to carve some gill plates, but I always like to have the eye sockets in place before I start carving, just to be able to use it to sight to make sure I got a nice even carving. By using the original drawing as a little bit of a template, I'm able to put down some reasonable carving lines that hopefully I can follow. I'm going to go ahead and do some simple carving in here, and hopefully it'll come out looking pretty good. Camphor is not the cleanest carving, but it sands really easy, so I'll be able to improve the look of this with a little bit of sandpaper. Alright, I'm pretty happy with the way the carving came out. Not perfect, but I think it looks pretty good. Alright, it's time to separate the pieces. This is always a little bit nerve-wracking because you can definitely do damage here. Alright, not bad. Alright, that's not too bad. Pretty happy with that. These sponge blocks are perfect for sanding out the inside of the joint because it's a 45 and a 45 making a 90, and these corners are 90 degrees. So these things will make quick work of this. On the tail piece, the saw got off track. Well, I got off track with the saw, and I kind of marred it. So I put a little bit of putty in there. This is glazing putty. So I'll keep sanding the joint cuts, and we'll get back to this when it's nice and smooth. Alright, so I'm starting to doubt my idea of having the tail be its own thing, but you don't know when you have a bad idea until you go all the way through with it and find out. So I've drawn out a template of a tail, and I put it on the teak wood that I'm using to make this thing, and you can see it's got a little bit of a wedge to it, so I'm using that to my advantage. So it has a more natural kind of tail wedge kind of shape. And cutting this out is going to be no fun with this giant blade. All right, so this is not the ugliest tail I've ever made, but it's not all that great either, but pretty happy with it. It's got a nice taper to it. And I'm gonna carve in those little fin lines there with this little pencil engraver. I got this for like $7 at Harbor Freight. Don't run out and buy one. I haven't really decided whether I like it yet. It runs on 2 AA batteries, and not sure if it'll focus on it, but it's got a little tiny micro carving head on it. That's not too bad. All right, now I need to cut these fins in the spots they need to be cut because they're going to be separated by the joints. So I'm just going to draw a line right where the body ends. Now I'm faced with some decisions to make about what to do to paint this, because I really need to paint this thing as an assembly. When I pull this apart, there's going to be 6 parts. Well, actually 8 when I pull the tail apart too. So what I think I'm going to do is pull all the halves apart and then put them all back together on a long piece of tape and use that as my holder to rotate it and paint it on. Then I'll have to figure out a way to protect that paint while I glue all the parts all back together with that hinge fabric all in it, and then do touch up and clear coat. I think that'll work. I'm making this up as I go along, so come along for the ride. All right, there's one pulled apart. 2, 3, and now for this little dude. There we go. All right, so after a lot of fiddling with this, this is what the little lure train looks like, all assembled. And I'll be able to hold this, hopefully. And in case you're wondering, the little fin segments I glued just to one side of the body. This way I can pull it back apart. And we'll just take and put this on one of my extendable lure holders. And we'll extend it out just a little bit, just to put some tension on it. And I think that'll do it. Let's hope it just holds together like this. All right, so what I'm gonna do is take this thing outside and paint it with white primer. This is just a flat white primer. Here's my plan. I'm gonna go ahead and paint this thing, put all the colors on it, put all the detail colors on it, let that dry, and then give it like 2 or 3 good heavy coats of polyacrylic to seal it, and then that should protect it from me handling it, because I'm gonna have to pull it all back apart, get the hinge in there, glue it all back together, let all that set, touch up the paint, and then put the clear coat on. Not to mention I've got to get the hardware in it too, so. Painting the inside of those joints is a little bit of a challenge, but we got it. Let's get this back inside. All right, so to be able to hold this thing, I'm gonna have to get an old piece of equipment out. This is a big block of wood with a lure holder on it, and I made this so I could hold big lures that I was chroming, but I don't use it anymore until now. And this just fits in there, and we should be able to just rotisserie this thing as we paint it. And as you can see, this thing is a bit of a complicated build. We're on the home stretch here, but I'm gonna have to call it quits on this video. We're gonna have to pick up on part 2, where I pull this back apart, put the continuous hinge in there, put it all back together, touch up the paint, put the clear coat on it, and then put it in the water. And hopefully we'll get some underwater shots and maybe even do some fishing. So if while you've been watching this, you've gotten better ideas than what I'm using, let me know how you would have done this, how you would have sequenced the work, because really that's the challenge with a lure like this. All right, don't forget to drop a like if you're enjoying this stuff. And if you haven't subscribed, shame on you, subscribe. And don't forget, we're gonna be doing the question of the week every week. So if you want your question to be considered for the next week's video, put it in the comments, and I'll try to pick a question that is either like super unique or has a really broad appeal. All right, I'll see you guys next Friday.